Welcome to the Subcommittee on Energy and Environment and our very important hearing on the future of coal under climate legislation. For the information of the members, this hearing is being televised, recorded by C-SPAN, and we thank Mr. Shimkus for his help in making sure that we have the cameras working. We have portable cameras in here today, and showing the ingenuity of technological innovation when necessity requires. And that breakthrough is the same kind of breakthrough that I think we're going to hear from in coal and its sequestration and other potential processes. Before we get started this morning, I want to inform the members and their staff that tomorrow, from noon to 1 p.m., the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, will brief our members and their staffs. The subject of the briefing will be global climate change and the international negotiations leading to the UN Climate Conference this December in Copenhagen. This briefing is for subcommittee members and their staffs only and will not be open to the public or the media. Secretary General Ban will address the subcommittee, after which members will have an opportunity to direct questions to him. This is a great chance for us to have an open exchange with the Secretary General on this critical issue, and I strongly urge the members to attend so that they can do so. There is a growing consensus that to avoid catastrophic climate change, we must cut global greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2050. U.S. emissions must be cut by at least 80% in the same period. Those objectives, quite simply, cannot be achieved unless we act quickly to control coal-fired power plants. Coal supplies half of all electricity in the United States, and we have the largest coal reserves in the world. China and India also have abundant reserves and are even more coal dependent. But while coal is plentiful, it's also the leading source of global warming pollution. Coal-fired power plants are responsible for over a quarter of all U.S. and global greenhouse gas emissions. We are at a watershed moment. By 2030, U.S. electricity demand is expected to increase by 30%, and global demand will double. Coal's role in meeting that demand will play a huge role in determining the fate of our planet. Globally, as many as 3,000 coal-fired power plants are projected to be built by 2030. These new plants alone would increase global emissions by 30%. At the same time, coal's future here in the United States is deeply uncertain. In the face of escalating public opposition and regulatory risk, dozens of planned coal-fired plants have been canceled in the last 2 years. The Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration is now predicting a flat line in construction of new coal plants over the next 20 years. Meanwhile, the Environmental Protection Agency is expected to move forward with regulation of carbon dioxide emissions from power plants and other sources under the Clean Air Act. Carbon capture and storage, or CCS, offers a path forward for coal, an opportunity for the U.S. economy, and a bridge to a low-carbon future. CCS generally involves capturing CO2 emissions at the source and disposing of the CO2 in deep geological formations. All indications are that CCS is a viable interim solution to the coal problem. CCS could also dramatically increase domestic oil production by providing abundant CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. Ultimately, CCS can go beyond geological disposal. For example, Silicon Valley-based Calera Corporation is proposing to convert captured CO2 into cement. That technology could be a game changer a win-win solution that would dramatically reduce cement's carbon footprint while sequestering billions of tons of CO2 from power plants. All these advances are possible, but only if we enact the right policies to drive innovation. The economic recovery package passed last month includes $3.4 billion in advanced coal technology funding, much of which will be used for CCS demonstration projects. But ultimately, only climate legislation can provide CCS the boost it needs. To create jobs and unleash the private sector's vast resources and ingenuity, we need regulatory drivers and strong incentives. An economy-wide cap on global warming pollution will provide the long-term investment incentive. But the cap alone will not ensure rapid deployment of CCS. To drive innovation, we must require new coal plants to use CCS by a certain date. At the same time, we must provide robust financial incentives for early development of this technology. This carrot-and-stick approach was included both in my ICAP legislation and in the discussion draft put forward by Mr. Dingell and Mr. Boucher last year. If we fail to bring CCS online quickly, we will have the worst of all worlds. Coal's future here in the United States will remain dim, and the fleet of coal-fired plants being built in China and India will swamp whatever emissions reductions we achieve at home. But if we blaze this trail, the world will follow, and we will reap the environmental and economic rewards of leadership. I trust that this morning's hearing will help guide us in that endeavor. Let me turn now and recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The future of coal mirrors the future of our economy. Coal provides inexpensive American-made energy to power our manufacturing sector and keep electricity affordable for millions of Americans. And like it or not, without coal, the U.S. would hemorrhage millions of jobs. Electricity rates would skyrocket, and we would become dependent on imported natural gas to meet electricity demand. At a recent hearing, Treasury Secretary Geithner said, "Cap and trade will increase the cost of energy on those fuels that are high in carbon. For people whose behavior is energy use doesn't change, their costs will go up," end quote. Translation, coal has a big target on its back, and America's working families already struggling will get stuck with a bill. Now is not the time to send those costs higher. Now is not the time to turn our back on coal. It is imperative that we continue to take advantage of our nation's vast coal resources, which have the promise to produce clean and affordable power for generations. And in our quest to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and protect the environment, we must promote clean coal technologies that will not only keep costs down for consumers, but also foster new jobs and a strong economy. These technologies exhibit great promise, and encouraging advancements in carbon capture, we'll be able to responsibly fortify our nation's energy supply with American-made energy and protect the pocketbooks of our nation's consumers as well. Last year, members of this committee introduced legislation that would block any new coal-fired power plant without carbon capture and sequestration. At the same time, I introduced bipartisan legislation with Rep. Boucher, Barton, and Shimkus that would spur investment in CCS technologies. And surprisingly, none of the co-sponsors of the anti-coal bill co-sponsored our bill that would ensure CCS actually would become available. We plan on reintroducing our CCS deployment bill in the next few days, and I would hope members of this committee will join us in co-sponsoring that important legislation. In 2008, the IEA noted CCS offers a viable and competitive route to mitigate CO2 emissions. Current spending and activity levels are nowhere near enough. Investment in CCS will only occur if there are suitable financial incentives. The next 10 years will be critical, end quote. To put our existing policies in perspective, wind currently enjoys a subsidy of $24.35 per megawatt hour versus 44 cents for coal, $24.35 versus 44 cents. Wind must be an important part of the overall equation, but it will never compare to the baseload generation that we need from coal. To replace the 3,300 megawatt coal-fired plant in Monroe, Michigan, that sits on 200 acres and runs at greater than 90% capacity would require 6,000 wind turbines covering some 300,000 acres, generating at 30% capacity, and over 2,300 megawatts of natural gas generation to act as a backup at nearly double the cost. By ensuring that CCS becomes available, we won't need to set arbitrary mandates that will send electricity rates through the roof and American jobs overseas. We have a choice: pursue irrational policies that will bankrupt America's working families and eviscerate our economy, or pursue sound policies that in fact will improve our environment, preserve the intensity of our economy, and keep costs down for consumers. We are clearly at a crossroads. Whatever course of action we pursue, we do so with the economy in a precarious position. By using a common sense, no regrets legislative approach that focuses on deployment of all clean energy, we can avoid a costly cap and trade scheme that will have no impact on emissions from the developing world. Instead, we'll advance technology that creates U.S. jobs and provides the opportunity to export. Working Americans will be better off. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing is about the future of coal, and as we seek to reduce both domestic and global greenhouse gases, addressing the use of coal will be at the center of our efforts in the years to come. The U.S. has abundant reserves of coal, and generating electricity from coal is inexpensive relative to other fuel types. Currently, roughly half of our nation's power is supplied by coal. Although coal is abundant, the emissions resulting from its use are massive. Burning coal results in roughly twice as much carbon dioxide being emitted as compared to using natural gas. Coal-fired plants, which are large and typically have lifespans measured in decades, can emit millions of tons of carbon dioxide per year. Today, about 80% of the CO2 emissions from domestic electricity generation come from coal. The U.S. and other countries are recognizing there is simply no way we can continue to use coal the way we do today if we intend to tackle climate change in a meaningful way. State energy companies, and particularly the investment community, have all begun to understand this new reality. With EPA regulation of carbon pollution imminent, new coal facilities are facing longer delays and more cancellations. Climate change legislation that provides a framework for the substantial reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and that lays down clear rules going forward will provide certainty to the marketplace. This is necessary to protect our planet, necessary to ensure the long-term viability of coal, both domestically and globally. Today's hearing will examine the technologies that could allow for the continued use of coal while substantially reducing carbon dioxide emissions. In particular, we will hear about the technologies that will enable us to capture carbon and store it in geologic formations and underground. I believe these technologies hold great promise. The individual components of carbon capture and storage, or CCS technologies, are well understood and in many cases have been used in industrial settings for years. The challenge ahead of us is putting all the pieces together in a way to enable the cost-effective production of low-carbon electricity from coal. I hope this hearing will explore the ways in which federal climate legislation can help industry deploy CCS to realize its full economic and technical potential. Accomplishing that objective is essential if coal use is to be part of our nation's low-carbon energy future. I look forward to hearing the input of our witnesses on what role coal can play as we seek to address the threat of global climate change and as we transform our nation's economy to low-carbon sources of power. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you starting this hearing at 9:30. You saved me from having to go to a political meeting at the NRCC. So there is one good thing about this. It is good to have the hearing record being established. on climate change and potential legislation, I am seriously supportive of establishing a true and fair record. And I think today's hearing is probably the, I'd say, I'm not sure how many others you're going to have, but I believe this is one of the most important ones, if not the most important, because as the chairman just pointed out and other members of the panel, we're generating half of our base power load of electricity with coal, and it's an abundant domestic resource. We have somewhere between 250 and 500 years of supply of coal, depending on the technologies that we choose to employ. And something that's not often said, but I think needs to be said, it's our cheapest baseload fuel source. I know the advocates of climate change legislation aren't too concerned about the cost, but if you look at the map of states like Kentucky and West Virginia and Ohio, their average retail price for electricity is somewhere between 5 and 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour. They get over 90% of their electricity from coal, generated by coal power. On the other hand, if you look at your state, Mr. Markey, it gets only 2% of its electricity from coal generation, and its base load cost, retail cost, is 15.4 cents a kilowatt hour. The full committee chairman's state of California, electricity cost at retail is almost 15 cents. Well, you know, you compare 5 cents to 15 cents, that's 300% cost differential. Now, if you're a Hollywood producer, probably doesn't matter much. But if you're a manufacturer that's operating on a 2% margin, you have to decide whether to keep your plant open in Ohio or move it to Mexico or China, it matters a lot. So coal matters. Our economy matters. We're in a very serious economic situation, and we start shutting down coal-fired power plants, we just make our economic problems worse, not better. And the issue at hand is the capture of CO2. Now, CO2 is not a criteria pollutant under the Clean Air Act. It's not like lead. It's not like sulfur dioxide. It's not like ozone. It's not like any of those things. CO2 is a naturally occurring compound. It is a greenhouse gas. That is a true statement. It is not a pollutant in the sense of the word that it's harmful to public health. Now, I am producing CO2 as I speak. I drink 3 or 4 Diet Dr. Peppers a day. They have CO2 in them. That's what makes it a carbonated beverage. So it's a little bit different breed of cat. And we can be on both sides of the issue. Somebody like me who's a climate change skeptic and somebody like Mr. Markey or Mr. Waxman who's a true believer and still think that we need to do something to capture or convert CO2 if we can do it economically. If we can do it economically. We don't want to raise the price of coal to 15 cents a kilowatt hour at retail. We don't want to destroy the industrial base of America. So if we get this right, and Mr. Boucher has got a bill to do the research to see if there is a technology that works. I'm a co-sponsor. I'm going to be a co-sponsor when he reintroduces it sometime in the near future. You know, if we can get coal right in America, Mr. Markey can be happy, and I can be happy, and everybody can be happy, and all God's children can be happy. But we got to get it right. We can't kill coal. And so I'm glad to see David Crane here. His company's a big industrial producer of electricity in Texas, and we're proud that he is, although I wish he wasn't headquartered in New Jersey. It kind of galls me, but that's the way it is. I'm glad to see Mr. Hawkins here because he's one of the international experts. And I'm glad to see somebody from the Mining Association and Mrs. Patton who's going to talk about some of the liability issues. This is a good panel, Mr. Chairman. And as I said earlier, this is, I think, the most important hearing. And if we get this hearing right and the policy coming out of it right, our country has a chance to stay economically competitive. So with that, I yield back.
Great. We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Chairman Emeritus Dingell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. It is an important one. The future of coal is an issue that must be addressed if we are to succeed in passing meaningful climate change legislation. As we all know, currently coal generates more than 50% of the United States electricity supply. We have hundreds of years of coal reserves. Realistically, coal must and will play a significant part in our energy future. The challenge, however, is to balance the need for dramatically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions with the continuing need for coal to power this nation. To meet this challenge, legislation must spur development and deployment of carbon capture and sequestration, CCS technology. China and India's reliance on coal makes the need for this technology that much greater. And when I hear my friends amongst the environmentalists tell us how we should develop technology, I agree. But this is some of the technology that should be developed here. One approach this committee considered at a hearing last year is Mr. Boucher's Carbon Capture and Storage Early Deployment Act. I was very sympathetic and remain so to that excellent piece of legislation. This bill is based on recommendations put forward last year by the Advanced Coal Technology Work Group, an advisory panel to the EPA. I urge this committee to look at this draft legislation when considering broader climate change legislation, although some changes may be appropriate given CCS provisions in the stimulus bill. Incorporating large-scale grant programs to accelerate the commercial demonstration of CCS and for testing carbon dioxide storage sites is essential to the success of CCS and therefore essential to the success of comprehensive climate change legislation. We are also becoming aware of the fact that there are now technologies which can be used by this country to convert CO2 emissions from power plants into a useful raw material for other industrial processes. This also must be pushed forward. The committee should also consider the CCS deployment program that Representative Boucher and I and other members of this committee released last year. We proposed an incentive system for carbon capture and sequestration technology. Power plants and large emitters that adopt CCS technology early would receive bonus allowances. A similar incentive system was included in the Blueprint for Action put forward by USCAP, an alliance of industry and environmental groups. Both the Boucher-Dingell draft and the Blueprint for Action couple the incentive program with requirements that ensure that newly permitted coal-fired facilities will employ technology to capture and store carbon emissions. The date for compliance, however, merits further discussion, in my view, as we yet do not know when CCS technology can be ready. Therefore, in this hearing, I look forward to hearing more about progress being made on CCS technology and prospects for wide-scale commercial use. Many questions still need to be answered, including, can we achieve significant emissions in greenhouse, can we achieve significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions before CCS technologies are ready? Are we doing enough to ensure that these technologies are on track? How will carbon stored underground impact water resources and the environment generally? What happens to CO2 after it's captured? Who owns it? Who is responsible for keeping it safe? These are just a few of the important questions that need to be answered about carbon capture and sequestration technology. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and learning more about the future of coal in climate legislation. And I warn that this country must proceed carefully, wisely, and well, lest we create greater harm than benefit. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Chairman Markey, thank you very much, and we certainly appreciate this important hearing on coal and the impact that environmental legislation or climate change legislation can have on this industry. I noticed that over the last couple of days, the 2009 International Conference on Climate Change has been meeting in New York city, and basically that is a group of skeptics of global climate change. Primarily, I noticed in reading some of the speeches yesterday, they were talking about the atmosphere of people creating an alarmist state on this whole issue. And that's one of the reasons why this hearing is particularly important, because when you have one entity, the coal industry, providing 50% of the electricity in our country, and then recently we met with a group of Chinese who came over, energy experts, and they set out the fact that in China they're bringing on one new coal-powered plant into operation about every 2 weeks. And that's why it's so vitally important that as we look at climate change legislation, we look at cap-and-trade legislation, we look at renewable mandates, and the impact that that can have on the economy in the U.S., particularly at this time when our economy is weakening, unemployment is going up. If we do not move very carefully, then I believe that we can put the United States at an economic disadvantage to other countries, particularly like China and India, who are relying more and more on the fuel that produces electricity at the most economical cost. And the thing that's really frustrating about all of this is that as we look at the models projecting future global warming, it's really almost impossible to detect the total cost of what the impact of that might be. And yet we can very clearly demonstrate the cost of renewable mandates and how much they will increase electricity, how that will make us less competitive in the global marketplace, and will go a long way, I believe, in harming our economy as we try to come out of this economic decline. So I look forward to this hearing. I think it's vitally important, and I yield back. I see I have no time to yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to start by thanking you for having this important hearing today. Mr. Chairman, it's clear that coal will remain the fuel that powers the world for years to come, even as we work dramatically to expand our own nation's renewable energy technologies. Your recognition of this fact is much appreciated, and I want to offer you my continued support as we put together policies and incentives to encourage the rapid and immediate deployment of widespread carbon capture and storage technologies. In a hearing last week, British Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, Ed Miliband, warned our committee about the massive expansion of the Chinese economy expected over the next decade. This is an economy that is 78% powered by coal and has projected increases in emissions that are many times the current emissions of the entire European Union. Without widespread development and deployment of CCS technologies here in the United States and the selling of these technologies to nations such as China, we will never be able to achieve the worldwide reductions we need to combat climate change. It's not a question of if we can do this. It's a question of how fast can we get it done. The building and export of clean technologies such as CCS will revitalize our nation's manufacturing base as America will become a world leader in the production of clean and cheap energy. Investments in CCS technology, as well as those in wind and solar power, will help lead this energy revolution here at home, while the technologies we export will generate tremendous carbon reductions abroad. I look forward to continuing to work closely with you, Mr. Chairman, so that we can make the widespread deployment of CCS a reality here at home as well as abroad, and I yield back.
We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to respect your comments from last week and start in third gear, not overdrive, as I did last time. But to my colleague from Pennsylvania, I think that was the same guy who said he's not going to permit a single new coal-fired power plant in his country in that discussion. And I think that's what this is all about. I also want to appreciate the C-SPAN coverage, Mr. Chairman. This is really important for the public to understand, and to if this is our only shot, then we need to take advantage of it. And it's a very good panel. I want to agree with Congressman Barton. Here's an article from the Alton Telegraph: 3,000 workers needed for refinery construction. There's an expansion going on. 100 full-time jobs will be added. This is what I want to see in the coal industry. But what I've seen, especially, and we talked about this too last week, Mr. Chairman, is Peabody. You're getting tired of seeing this. Peabody 10, 1,000 mine workers closed because of the Clean Air Act amendments. 1,000, actually 1,200. These are the individuals who lost their jobs. That's my passion, and that's my focus. I actually found out more stats. The United Mine, this is another request I have for you, Mr. Chairman, to invite the United Mine Workers here to talk about the impact of job loss, because I'm throwing out what happened in the Midwest. Hopefully they can give me the reasons why they're strangely silent on this bill. But after the 90 amendments, in southern Illinois alone, 18,200 mine workers were working the mines in southern Illinois. That United Mine Worker region was reorganized into a 3-state region that represented only 4,000 United Mine Workers. There's a devastating effect on this to jobs, rural America, and coal areas of this country. We better, in the words of John Dingell, tread very carefully, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And seeing my colleague from Illinois hold up that sign about 1,000 workers need to expand that refinery. We do expand refineries in my part of the country. And and it's interesting, following the merger, you said United Mine Workers. I have the same thing in my area. The United Steel Workers, we don't have any steel plants, so to speak, in my area, but now they represent all my refineries. So it's interesting on what the market and the economy has done. Today's hearing reflects on the critical need to address coal's future, both under future and climate legislation and within our broader national security, energy security strategy. While coal emits high levels of carbon dioxide, it is also one of our nation's most abundant energy resources. Long-term strategies must be in place to reduce coal's carbon footprint and incentivize new technology development for carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, in order to utilize our vast coal reserves. CCS is one of the most important possible solutions for climate change. Unlike capture, carbon injection technology is well established and has been used for enhanced oil recovery for over 30 years. The Permian Basin in West Texas is home to the majority of carbon dioxide injection in the entire world. This is good news for addressing climate change and producing more domestic energy. Federal policies to encourage the development of CCS-related technologies are key to avoiding severe cost disruptions in our economy. Several cost models for climate change tell us that one of the large variables for the impact of energy costs under the climate change program is the availability of CCS. EPA's analysis last year of Lieberman-Warner bill indicated that CCS could account for 30% of CO2 reductions by 2050, which would involve injecting several gigatons of CO2 underground. If CCS technologies were unavailable or not commercially viable, these reductions would have to come from elsewhere and likely at a higher cost. And I hope today's hearing and testimony would shed some light on the most appropriate policies, approaches to develop CCS technologies when allowance prices may not be sufficiently high to encourage rapid development of CCS. And, Mr. Chairman, like my colleague from Texas, I want to welcome Mr. Crane. NRG has a great office in Houston and does a lot of different things, although we'll try to do NRG just like we did Calpine. Calpine actually expanded more alternatives and natural gas facilities in my district that they did in California. So they opened up an office in Houston, California. Energy is now Calpine in Texas. So we don't mind you expanding your office in Houston. Let me go back my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. As pointed out by other speakers, the United States is the Saudi Arabia of coal. And we talked about the huge reserves that we have in this country. Recently, some of this research I put together in a paper that was published in the Stanford Law Review, December edition, so that I'm a strong advocate of coal, and I was happy to see that President Clinton recently said, President Obama recently said, quote, "This is America. We figure out how to put a man on the moon in 10 years. You can't tell me we can't figure out how to burn coal that we mine right here in the United States of America and make it work. So I think his statement, Mr. Chairman, shows that he recognizes with this huge reserves we have, it's a national security to use that and learn to mine it right, and to figure out how to burn coal that does not affect our environment. It's so abundant in this nation. In fact, on the average, coal costs $1 to $2 per million BTU, compared with $6 to $12 per BTU for oil or natural gas. And because of this plentiful and cost-effective coal reserves, power plants fueled by coal account for more than half of this nation's electricity production. But because of the recent regulatory uncertainty surrounding climate change legislation, only 12 new coal-fired power plants have been built in the United States since 1990. Coal is a prime source of energy throughout the world, as pointed out, particularly they're moving ahead in China, and will inevitably remain so as worldwide energy demand continues to rise. So, Mr. Chairman, any meaningful effort to achieve long-term sustainable reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions will depend on the development and deployment of new energy technologies, including advanced clean coal technology and carbon capture and sequestration. The rapid development, demonstration, and widespread deployment of such technologies are of paramount importance in any reasoned and effective effort to address climate change concerns. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. We thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
There's widespread agreement that the future of the country's economy, the future of the planet, my grandkids' future depend upon the ability to find a technology to use coal cleanly. But I want to make 2 points that have not been made here yet. Point number one, this requires a major technological transformation. It requires us to really look at the horizons and know the companies that are challenging those horizons right now. I want to list 3 of them. The Ramgen Power Systems company in Bellevue that has a compression technology that might reduce the cost of compression of CO2, which is necessary for geological sequestration, by 30%. The Calera Cement Company that's found a technology where you can sequester CO2 from coal-fired plants in building materials so that we can make CO2 part of our buildings rather than wasting it, putting it below ground. The Sapphire Energy Company in San Diego that has a way to take algae that can eat the CO2 from the smokestacks and produce a gasoline product chemically undistinguishable from gasoline. We need these technologies to advance, and that leads to point 2. We have to have a fund by which to fund this research and development. And here's the point I want to make to my friends who want to advance coal. To have that fund, we have to have an auction of the permits under the cap-and-trade system. If and only if we have an auction that will generate revenues that can be used to help the coal industry develop these technologies, does coal have a future in this country or anywhere in the planet? If we're going to sell these technologies to China, which we have to do so that China will not destroy the planet Earth, we're going to have a fund to invest in these technologies. The biggest debate in Congress this year on energy will be about this issue of whether we're going to have an auction or whether we're going to give these permits away and what we're going to use the money for. And I hope my friends who advocate for coal recognize the existence of this industry depends on actually having auctions and having the revenues that can save this industry for a future for the United States. So I know that seems counterintuitive to some of my friends of coal, but until we realize the necessity of those revenues, we're not going to get this job done. Thank you.
Okay. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing the testimony from the panel as we continue the process of exploring all of the various pieces that are involved in coming up with a comprehensive national energy policy. Again, I think as many of these issues are discussed, it shows the problems that are created by the fact that our country doesn't have a comprehensive strategy. But we've got to also recognize that coal is still a very viable and inexpensive source of energy, and in fact is a backup source of energy for many of these renewable sources. As we advance more wind and solar technologies, and I encourage us to do that, we all know that the wind doesn't blow all the time. We all know that the sun isn't shining all the time, and that coal is a backup source for many many of those renewable sources of energy. And some people do have a desire to bankrupt the coal industry. We've heard those comments. I think we need to be much more pragmatic about encouraging clean coal technologies to advance as opposed to literally bankrupting an industry that provides so much of our power and in an inexpensive way, and in a way that can be captured in a much more clean and economic process. And so I think as we look at some of these proposals, and especially the cap and trade proposals that are before us, which in essence is an energy tax, a tax on energy that by some estimates would cost American families up to $13,000 a year, $1,300 a year more in increased energy costs. I think that's a very dangerous road to go down as we're talking about an economic shortfall where we're trying to get our economy back on track. Let's make sure that we don't create policies that cost our economy thousands more jobs and cost American consumers up to $1,300 a year more in energy taxes. There is a better way to do it. There is a cleaner way to do it, and let's pursue those technologies instead of trying to bankrupt some at the benefit of others. So look forward to hearing the panel. Yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, we clearly need to include coal in our national energy mix, but I'm not really sold on carbon sequestration technology. We have the geologic formations. We probably have the technology, but are we going to be able to do this cost effectively? That's what I'm hoping you all can sell me on. I'm open-minded about it. I want to see what we can do here. But I'm a technical person, and I'm going to have the same sort of skepticism that my friend from Washington State has. So I look forward to your testimony. I yield the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you for convening this hearing today. The role of coal in climate change discussions is an important one. As most people know, coal is the most abundant energy resource in the United States and is particularly plentiful in my home state of Pennsylvania. It plays a crucial role in Pennsylvania's economy and will continue to do so as long as economically stifling climate change legislation does not force many coal-fired electricity plants out of business. While I believe it is essential to protect our environment and atmosphere, I do not believe it is prudent to bankrupt an industry that not only produces nearly 50% of our electricity today, but also provides jobs to countless Pennsylvanians and Americans throughout the country. Passing cap and trade legislation right now would certainly have a negative effect on the coal industry and on consumers who pay low prices for coal-generated electricity. It is essential that we work towards utilizing clean coal technology. We must take decisive action to ensure that coal generation can continue while taking steps to improve the process of carbon capture and sequestration. We must ensure that liability issues are resolved so that carbon capture and sequestration projects can forge ahead. Investors, owners, and operators need to have confidence that litigation will not squander their investments. We also need to continue to work towards reducing the cost of carbon capture and sequestration projects so that it becomes a practical and economically sensible process. If people truly believe we need to mitigate the effects of carbon in the atmosphere, it is every bit as important to pursue ways to use coal in a clean manner. I look forward to hearing the testimony today, and I yield back.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Boucher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to waive opening statement and reserve time for questions.
The gentleman reserves time. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm an interloper on this subcommittee today. Obviously, Nebraska is about 70% dependent on coal, so I want to hear what the industry has to say, and I'll yield back.
We thank the gentleman, and now we will turn to our witnesses. And we begin by welcoming Mr. David Hawkins, who is the director of the Natural Resources Defense Council's Climate Center. He is also a former assistant administrator of the EPA and has more than 30 years of experience on air quality, climate change, and energy policy issues. We welcome you, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for inviting me back to the committee. I'd like to highlight 6 points in my prepared testimony. The first is that to prevent a climate catastrophe, we simply cannot keep using coal the way we use it today. Coal is so abundant that even if we put a small fraction of the carbon that it contains into the air, global temperatures would rise to dangerous levels. New coal plants now on the drawing board around the world would put more carbon dioxide into the air over their operating lives than all the CO2 emitted from previous use of coal in human history. Second point is that carbon capture and disposal is ready for commercial deployment today, but without a strong climate protection law, this deployment simply will not happen. Third, the failure to enact climate protection legislation would be disastrous for the climate, but ironically, it would not assure a sustainable role for coal in the United States. Today, regulators and investors are saying, wait a minute, when it comes to new coal. The most recent Energy Information Administration forecast slashes projected coal builds for new coal builds in the United States by 60% from the forecast that it issued just a year ago. Other than plants already under construction, the EIA projects that essentially no new coal plants would be built for over a decade if climate policy remains unresolved. The fourth point is that coal needs more than carbon capture and disposal for it to serve as a 21st century fuel. Shameful practices like mountaintop mining removal, conventional air pollution, coal ash management, these things have to be fixed as well. But carbon capture and disposal could make coal and climate protection compatible. The fifth point is that carbon capture and disposal could help reduce our dependence on imported oil as well. NRDC estimates that the CO2 captured in a robust carbon capture and disposal program could support an expanded enhanced oil recovery industry large enough to back out about 2 million barrels of imported oil every day by 2020 and about 5 million barrels per day by 2025. In addition, electricity made from coal plants with carbon capture and disposal could back out more oil by powering plug-in hybrids. The sixth point I'll make is that business leaders and environmental groups are coming together and have proposed a policy package that would both help protect the climate and speed deployment of carbon capture and disposal in the United States. In January of this year, the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, USCAP, issued its blueprint for legislative action. In addition to an economy-wide cap on global warming pollution, the blueprint recommends a 4-part package for using carbon capture and disposal to cut coal plant emissions. The first recommendation is to direct EPA and other agencies to adopt rules required for CO2 transport and disposal. Second, to fund 5 gigawatts of coal plants with carbon capture and disposal by 2015. Third, to enact CO2 emission standards for new coal plants now. And fourth, to provide direct payments to create incentives for carbon capture and disposal in the early period of the CAP program. Enactment of this package, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, would make carbon capture and disposal a reality in the United States in the next few years and would show leadership to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Our next witness is David Crane. Mr. Crane is President and CEO of NRG Energy, a leading wholesale power generation company. He has many years of experience and was previously the CEO of International Power. We welcome you, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to members of the committee and particularly Congressmen Barton and Green for their kind words to me. And I want to start by thanking you for addressing climate change and combating climate change, which we believe is the critical task before us. We think clean coal is the key to successful combating of climate change, and carbon capture and sequestration is the key to clean coal. So again, we applaud you shining a spotlight on this technology, this issue, which unfortunately remains obscure to the American public. NRG is a company that owns power plants. We own 24,000 megawatts of power plants across the country. That's enough to power 20 million American homes. About 1/3 of our generation is coal. I think we're the 5th largest consumer of Powder River Basin coal. And we span the great expanse of red states to blue states in that we have coal-fired power plants in Texas, Delaware, New York State, and Chairman Markey, in your home state of Massachusetts. We are not a rate-based utility. We are not able to socialize the costs that we bear to the public, but they are borne by our shareholders. And since 2006, we have been investing our shareholders' money in decarbonizing generation. We've built 270 megawatts of wind in Texas. We announced last week an intent to build 500 megawatts of solar thermal plants in California and New Mexico. And we believe we will be the first company to build a new nuclear plant in the United States, having filed with the NRC a year and a half ago to build a 2,700 megawatt nuclear plant in Texas, which our company has already spent close to $200 million on just to file the permit. All told, what we have going so far would be about a $10 billion investment and create about 9,000 high-paying jobs. If we succeed in all we do, we would achieve a significant reduction in our carbon intensity. As a company, currently we produce about 64 million tons of carbon emissions in the United States in order to make about 70 to 80 million megawatt hours of production. But when you hear the list of things we're doing, noticeably absent from that list is clean coal. And if I say one thing that this committee remembers, one of the things I've been saying to our investors when they say, you know, David, are you really able to develop nuclear power plants? I say, developing nuclear power plants in this environment is easier than doing clean coal. That's the part that's really a challenge. But this is not for want of trying on our behalf. In 2006, we won an award from the state of New York to build an integrated gasification combined cycle plant. 2 years later, after spending over $10 million of our shareholders' money, that project, which was started by the Pataki administration, was canceled by the Patterson administration. And in fairness to the Patterson administration, it just proved that doing a full-blown IGCC project with CCS was just beyond the reach of any private company working with any state at this point in time. So again, we heartily support the federal government's effort to support this. I would just like to quickly list what we see as the 5 main obstacles to going forward with commercial scale CCS. Obviously, the first one is there's no price on carbon in the United States right now. The second would be even if there was a price, it would unlikely to be set at a level that would incent carbon capture and sequestration. The lack of a proper legal and regulatory scheme proved to be an enormous impediment to us with our New York project. The fourth point would be that the normal government incentives, production tax credits, loan guarantees are not particularly useful in the course of CCS, particularly when you're talking about post-combustion carbon capture, which of all forms of carbon capture is by far the most important because of its ability to be retrofitted on existing plants. And my colleague, Mr. Alex, will, I'm sure, talk about that more. And the fifth point, which in this day and environment, there's actually no money available, you know, from our normal sources for anything, much less new technologies. So I would like to just a few thoughts for the committee to consider. One is I think that the big bang approach to going with CCS, as maybe reflected by Future Gen, is not going to be the quickest or the most cost-effective way to go forward. I have nothing against Future Gen, but I think there are other things that the committee can incent. I think that when looking at brownfield coal plants, I think one thing the committee should recognize is that our analysis indicates that the best use for those plants is not to be retrofitted for post-combustion carbon capture, but probably to be converted to gas so that they can firm renewables on a basis. And that, and the last point I would make, and I respectfully would disagree with Congressman Inslee, whose book I've read and who I respect in his opinions, but we don't support 100% auction because we think that the best people to get the carbon out of coal are coal companies and coal-using power generation companies. So we support the U.S. CAP blueprint, which calls for transitional partial allocations plus auction for early funding. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Crane, and thank you for the shout-out for Mr. Inslee's book as well. We appreciate that. And that's why we have these cameras working again. Our next witness, Mr. Ian Duncan, who is the Associate Director for Earth and Environmental Systems for the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Duncan was the geologic sequestration lead for the Texas Future Gen team and focuses on the technical and legal aspects of long-term carbon storage. We welcome you, sir. Whenever you're ready, please begin. Microphone down a little bit. Okay, good. And in a little bit closer. Thank you.
I'm part of the Gulf Coast Carbon Center at the University of Texas, which is dedicated to doing the science, engineering, and policy research necessary to establish a successful sequestration industry in the Gulf Coast. My personal research is in the business, operational, and long-term risks associated with CO2 sequestration. I'm going to organize my remarks around the 4 questions that you asked, Mr. Chairman, in your invitation. The first question was, what experience do we have from CO2-enhanced oil recovery and other experience to help determine the feasibility of large-scale CO2 sequestration? The CO2 EOR industry in the U.S., over 80% of it in Texas, has transported 600 million tons of CO2 over the last 37 years. It's injected 1,200 million tons into oil reservoirs in West Texas. Just to give you an example, the Sackrock field currently injects about 13 million tons of CO2, and each year 6 to 7 million tons of that is retained in the reservoir. And by that mark, this is the largest sequestration project in the world if it was using anthropogenic CO2. Only part of it is. The safety record of the industry is stellar. There have been no deaths, no serious injuries related to the injection of this CO2 or the transportation. As a scientist, that's somewhat problematical to me in that it's very difficult to calculate statistics from the null set, so I'm got some challenges as to how to do this. Second question, what degree of confidence can we have in the feasibility and safety of CO2 sequestration? Let me first define risk. Risk is likelihood or probability times consequence. Risky things typically have a probability of about 10 to the minus 3. Things that we perceive as being not risky, such as driving on the road and air travel, have risks of about 10 to the minus 4, 10 to the minus 5. Most of the risks that I've evaluated in associated with CO2 sequestration so far have risks on the order of 10 to the minus 5 to 10 to the minus 7. So there's several orders of magnitude less risky than flying in a plane. Now, that's not to say that CCS and carbon sequestration is going to be risk-free. However, if it's done in a proper way, if it's regulated well, I think the risks are comparable to other industrial operations. The one that we know least about is the long-term risk to contamination of water. And this risk is clearly site-dependent. In other words, there are some sites where one would infer that the probability would be higher. There are other sites where the consequences, the water resources, are more valuable. This leads to the third question, what are the principal regulatory obstacles? I would assess that the EPA has done a commendable job in its draft rules for Class 6 wells. However, there is no mechanism in the EPA rules to identify the best sites for sequestration. The regulations are purely binary, sort of like a pass-fail exam. And the EPA does not, in my opinion, have the authority to drive a mechanism to select best sites. Final question, what role can CCS play in expanding enhanced oil recovery and impact of U.S. oil supply? In Texas, if we were capturing CO2, we could gather an extra 3.8 billion barrels of oil. This is equivalent to discovering a giant field in Texas. However, there is an issue. There is no currently considered regulation of CO2 EOR in terms of sequestration. I would think that a Class 2A regulation, A being anthropogenic, would help to introduce sequestration as part of enhanced oil recovery, and this would help develop CCS in conjunction with enhanced oil recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan, very much. Our next witness is Mr. Frank Alex, CEO and co-founder of PowerSpan, a New Hampshire-based company currently working on carbon dioxide capture technology for electric power companies. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to share my perspective on the future of coal under climate legislation. My testimony today will focus on the prospects for commercial deployment of carbon capture technologies on coal-fired power plants. PowerSpan has been developing and commercializing advanced clean coal technology since 1994. Our approach to CO2 capture, called ECO2, is a post-combustion process designed to capture 90% of CO2 emissions. The technology is suitable for retrofit to the existing coal-fired generating fleet and for new coal-fired plants. Pilot-scale testing of our ECO2 technology began in December of 2008 at First Energy's Berger plant in southeastern Ohio. The ECO2 pilot was designed to treat a 1 megawatt flue gas stream and capture 20 tons of CO2 per day. Initial testing has demonstrated 80% CO2 capture efficiency, which is a promising start. We recently completed 2 minor design modifications that we expect will increase CO2 capture rate to 90%. The pilot plant was built using the same type of equipment that we plan to use in commercial systems. Therefore, successful operation of the pilot unit will confirm our design assumptions and cost estimates for large-scale CCS projects. Although commercial-scale CCS projects still have some risk, that risk is manageable because the major equipment used in the ECO2 process has been used in other commercial applications at the scale required for CCS. Our experience in the emerging market for commercial-scale CCS projects supports our optimism. In 2007, Basin Electric Power Cooperative conducted a competitive solicitation for a post-combustion CO2 capture technology to retrofit their Antelope Valley Station, which is a coal-fired power plant located in Beulah, North Dakota. The Antelope Valley project will install CO2 capture equipment on a 120 megawatt flue gas slipstream taken from a 450 megawatt unit. Basin Electric has targeted 90% CO2 capture efficiency to provide 1 million tons of CO2 annually for enhanced oil recovery. 6 of the leading CO2 vendors for post-combustion capture technology responded to the Antelope Valley solicitation, and after a detailed evaluation, Basin Electric selected PowerSpan. This commercial CCS project is scheduled to start up in 2012. Since being selected for the Antelope Valley project, a feasibility study has confirmed that there are no technical limitations to deploying ECO2 at the plant. The study estimated costs of less than $40 per ton for 90% CO2 capture and compression. A similar study of ECO2 recently conducted for a new 760 megawatt supercritical coal plant estimates CO2 capture costs of under $30 per ton. A third engineering study focused on ECO2 scaling risk determined that our pilot plant will provide sufficient design information to confidently build commercial-scale systems up to 760 megawatts. Independent engineering firms led the feasibility, cost, and scaling studies for our prospective customers. As a sign of our confidence, we will back our commercial ECO2 installations with industry-standard performance guarantees. Despite the promise indicated by the Basin Electric project, strong government action is needed to ensure timely deployment of CCS technology to support climate change mitigation goals. Government action should focus on 3 areas. 1, a strong market-based cap on greenhouse gas emissions. 2, a CO2 emission performance standard for new coal-based power plants. 3, early deployment incentives for commercial-scale CCS systems. Incentives are needed to ensure early deployment of CCS because CO2 capture technology is not yet commercially proven on large coal plants, and early CO2 prices will not be sufficient to offset CCS costs. To be most effective, CCS incentives must provide long-term CO2 price certainty to facilitate project financing and must be awarded competitively, preferably by reverse auction, in order to minimize costs while also providing a market signal on the real cost for early CCS installations. Early deployment of CCS technology will also create jobs and promote economic growth. CCS projects require 3 to 4 years to implement and create significant economic activity over their duration. In addition, by incenting early deployment of CCS, the U.S. can assume a leading position in this critical sector and create a thriving high-tech export business and the quality jobs that come with it. In summary, CO2 capture technology is commercially available from several qualified vendors with standard commercial guarantees. Independent studies show that early commercial installations of CO2 capture technology are likely to be successful. The cost of widespread deployment of these technologies appear manageable, particularly when compared to the cost of other low-carbon electricity solutions. The most important reason to promote early deployment of CCS is that post-combustion CO2 capture technologies will preserve the huge investment in existing coal-fired power plants and allow us to effectively use abundant low-cost coal reserves in the U.S. and developing nations, even in a climate-constrained world. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Alex, very much. Our next witness is Mr. Hal Quinn, who is the President and CEO of the National Mining Association. The National Mining Association represents coal, metal, and industrial mineral producers, as well as equipment manufacturers and suppliers. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and good morning to members of the subcommittee. I'd just like to make several points this morning. Several of them have been well documented here in your opening statements. But the first being, it's quite simple.
You need to turn that mic on.
Oh, thank you. First point being is coal is indispensable for meeting our energy needs here and worldwide for the foreseeable future. It's precisely because of the virtues of coal that were stated this morning in many of the opening statements, its abundance and affordability, that it supplies over half the electricity in this country. And because of that, those virtues, it also provides 125,000 high-paying jobs for U.S. coal miners, as well as thousands of other jobs for many of the businesses and industries that depend on affordable and reliable electricity to remain competitive worldwide. Now, globally, coal has been the most rapidly growing fuel in the world. Countries such as China and India already rely upon coal to meet over 70% of their electricity needs. They, like us, depend on coal to sustain their economies and to raise their standard of living. The second point is that as follows. Neither this nation nor the global community can address climate effectively without advanced clean coal technologies, including, and most importantly, carbon capture and storage. Between 2007 and 2030, global energy demand is projected to increase by 50%. CO2 emissions are projected to increase by 57%, according to the International Energy Agency. Virtually all this emissions growth will come from non-OECD nations. And the point being is if the United States and every OECD nation completely stopped using coal, 75% of the world's CO2 emissions would remain untouched and unaddressed. In other words, without CCS, we deprive ourselves of the most effective tool for addressing climate change, particularly in the developing world. In other words, no climate policy will be successful without coal and CCS. This leads me to my third point. The United States must do much more to support and accelerate development and deployment of CCS technologies. $3.4 billion in clean coal technologies, including CCS, provided for in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, is a good first step. But we need to push the technology as hard and fast as we can, as noted by many members of this subcommittee this morning. And this will require further investment by the government and the industry. As the World Resources Institute has pointed out, CCS technologies not only have to be tested and brought up to scale, but also have to be integrated on a series of electricity generation platforms. That is a challenge beyond the sole scope of the first adopters in the coal-based generation community. Similarly, as others have pointed out, a carbon price signal alone is insufficient. There has to be a push as well as a pull to get the job done. The Carbon Capture and Storage Early Deployment Act, sponsored by Representatives Boucher, Barton, Upton, Woodfield, and Shimkus, provides such a push through a mechanism for sustained funding to support development and deployment of the enabling CCS technology. This brings me to my fourth point for your consideration. The solution we all seek requires that we harmonize the timing when controls are placed on emissions with the commercial availability of the critical CCS technologies needed to reduce them. The consequences of getting this policy wrong could be dire. The period of time between when promising technologies are developed and their successful commercialization is often referred to as a potential valley of death. By extension, industries may confront a valley of death if they are trapped in the period between the mandate requiring a certain level of performance and the availability of the technology enabling them to meet the requirement. The same fate could befall our economy if we impose harsh restrictions that jeopardize our ability to meet electricity demand before we have the necessary tools to meet future emissions requirements. Our current economic crisis reminds us all the more of the importance of structuring any actions responsibly so we can meet both our environmental and economic goals. In short, the solution must be sustainable in every respect, environmentally, economically, and politically. To sum up, Mr. Chairman, let me just make the following, sum up the points. First, coal is indispensable for meeting our energy needs domestically and globally. No climate policy will be successful without coal with CCS. We must accelerate the development and deployment of CCS, and the policy solutions must harmonize the expectations with commercial availability of the enabling technology. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, sir. And our final witness is Lindeen Patton. She is the Chief Climate Product Officer with Zurich Financial Services. Ms. Patton works on developing insurance products that address the risk associated with climate change. We welcome you.
Thank you. Chairman Markey, distinguished members of the Energy and Environment Subcommittee, my name is Lindeen Patton, and I serve as the Chief Climate Product Officer for Zurich Financial Services. Zurich
Move
is
that
a global,
microphone in a little bit closer.
I'm sorry. Zurich is a global insurance company providing insurance and risk management solutions to customers in 170 countries. We have been serving customers in the United States since 1912. We are the third largest commercial property casualty insurer in this country with over 20,000 employees in the U.S. I would like to begin my testimony by thanking you for holding this critical and timely hearing, because immediate, concrete, and responsible actions, including the commercial scale deployment of carbon capture and sequestration, should be taken to reduce the risks associated with climate change. Zurich is in the business of risk management. In 2008, Zurich announced as part of its climate initiative that it would dedicate significant resources and apply its skills in the area of risk management to assist stakeholders in adapting to and mitigating the risks of climate change. Zurich has applied these skills specifically to commercial deployment of CCS. The focus of my testimony today will be identification of the essential risk management components of a legislative framework necessary to ensure the commercial deployment of CCS in an environmentally and economically sustainable manner. The role of an insurer in the CCS context is to assess risk, price risk, and create risk management best practices. Insurance imposes quality underwriting restrictions, which are not only in the interest of the insurer, but are in the interest of public good, reducing risk to property damage, bodily injury, environmental damage, and other economic loss. Insurance performs a role like no other in society, sending price signals to incentivize risk-reducing behavior. To ensure that commercial deployment of CCS occurs in a sustainable manner with respect to natural resources, the environment, and public safety, the following 4 elements of a risk management framework are critical. First, estimating the expected. Appropriate analysis is needed to estimate the expected value of financial consequences that may arise from each individual CCS site. Specialty insurers are expert at estimating these low-frequency, potentially catastrophic risks. Second, proper identification and quantification must inform permitting, operation, and maintenance requirements. No amount of insurance, trust fund, or other financial risk management system can overcome poor siting or inappropriate operating techniques. Third, establishment of a CCS safety board. With respect to siting, operational oversight, and long-term stewardship of CCS facilities, A private-public government corporation should be chartered and vested with the authority to oversee the siting and design of CCS facilities and the management of CCS facilities in the event of conflict of law or resources. Fourth, establishment of a CCS National Trust. A trust managed by the CCS Safety Board should be established to pay long-term stewardship costs only after the CCS facility is released from post-closure. Finally, it is critical that policymakers avoid the establishment of any liability scheme that would provide first-dollar indemnity for liability during operational, closure, or post-closure periods. No first-dollar indemnity should be provided by sovereigns for risks manifesting from CCS activities during operational, closure, or post-closure periods because indemnity separates actions from consequences and masks risk price signals. Simply put, first-dollar indemnity removes one of the greatest incentives to deploy CCS in an environmentally and economically sustainable manner. With respect to international action and implications of commercial-scale deployment, I have a few observations. If we as a global community are to meet 2050 emissions reductions recommended by the IPCC scientists, the U.S., Europe, and Australia China and India must reduce emissions from coal-fired power plants. Ultimately, it may be necessary not only to export U.S. CCS technologies to China and India, but also our risk management frameworks and policies. Countries in the EU and Australia are moving forward with CCS deployment now. In closing, Mr. Chairman, Zurich strongly believes private insurance has a critical role to play in the deployment of CCS, and we look forward to working with you, members of the committee, and your staffs to make this happen.
Thank you, Ms. Patton. The chair will now recognize himself for a round of questions. Mr. Crane, Mr. Hawkins outlined the U.S. CAP proposal for a package of incentives and regulations to drive deployment of CCS. Do you believe that that package can work?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do believe it works. I think the real focus would work. I mean, I think the real focus is how you get the 5 gigawatts in particular, what we call the rapid demonstration projects, how to get them up and running. But certainly the idea is to get up enough scale so that some of the costs of these projects come down, because I think everyone on the panel probably has their view on how much carbon capture and sequestration is going to cost. But until we do a few of these projects, it's all guesswork.
Thank you, Mr. Crane. Under the Obama administration, there's an expectation that the EPA finally will follow the law and move forward with regulating CO2 emissions from coal-fired power plants under the Clean Air Act. Given those facts, it seems to me that coal is only going to have a future in the United States if we enact comprehensive climate legislation that provides the financial incentives and regulatory drivers to make CCS technology a reality. Would each of you respond to whether you agree with that assessment? Mr. Hawkins?
Yes.
Mr. Crane?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Not really my field, I'm afraid.
Okay, fine. Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Mr. Quinton?
Yes, it's in our interest to get this issue resolved.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Patton?
From an insurer's perspective, insurance can accommodate the legal scheme of choice that's applied.
Mr. Alex, how significant is the potential of CCS technology to create jobs here in the United States? Are we at risk of losing this market to the Europeans and others if we fail to move forward aggressively?
I think the technology is being developed in many nations. When we competed in Canada, we competed against Japanese companies, French companies, Canadian companies, and certainly an individual project probably creates 500 jobs at its peak in construction and another 100 to operate the system. So there's certainly a danger that if others move before us, that they will develop technology that will create jobs abroad instead of in the U.S.
Now, I heard you describe your technology, Mr. Alex. I met recently with Brent Constance, who is a Stanford scientist who was the founder of Calera Corporation. Calera proposes to use CO2 captured from power plants and other sources to make cement, simultaneously sequestering the CO2 and reducing cement's carbon footprint. I was very impressed with that technology's potential. Are you familiar with that technology, Mr. Crane?
Mr. Chairman, in fact, the application that Calera has in front of the DOE for a loan guarantee is actually with our company at one of our coal plants. And you know, we wouldn't be doing that if we weren't impressed with the technology, but I just want to caution the chairman at Mr. Alex's technology needs to be scaled up from 1 megawatt to probably 100 megawatts next. I'll let him speak for himself, but the Calera technology is almost at the test tube stage. I mean, they don't even have a continuous process going right now. They're mixing it in batches right now. So when you think of the millions of tons of carbon that come out of a 500 megawatt power plant, it's a great promising technology that the government should support, but it's scaling up to utility-sized power plants is not around the corner when it comes to the Calera technology.
But if we had a cap placed upon carbon, would that not create a lot of market incentives for the development of technologies like that might completely surpass anything that we're now contemplating?
Disruptive technology. I agree with you completely, Mr. Chairman, that, putting a cap and trade system, to stimulate all sorts of innovation and disruptive technologies, you're exactly right.
What do you think the likelihood of that happening, Mr. Crane? That is, that a disruptive technology would in fact emerge, as it did. That is, YouTube and Google only have emerged because we changed from a narrowband to a broadband policy. If we move to a cap-and-trade system, do you think that that would encourage the private sector?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not a probability analysis guy. I'm just a poor businessman. But Dr. Duncan may have a better view on that. But I would say that over 20 or 30 years, I would be pretty confident that there'd be disruptive technologies. I would not be confident over the next 5 to 10 years. I think next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be slogging forward with what we have and demonstrating it at scale. So,
Mr. Hawkins, would you like to comment on that briefly?
Well, I would agree completely with Mr. Crane. The adoption of the economic signal from a cap-and-trade program will unleash all sorts of interest in exploring technologies and systems that will keep greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And in the next 5 or 10 years, we have lots of tools we can work with. The challenge is to get them deployed and create the market conditions. After that, we're going to see ideas coming out of the woodwork, and the regime for controlling global warming pollution 25 years from now is probably going to look very different than any analysis today would suggest.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. My time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been noted that I think since 1990 we've built we put online about 12 plants, 12 coal plants, which is slightly more than one per year, while at the same time China is bringing on a new coal plant virtually every single week. Wall Street is not financing any of the projects unless they have carbon capture as part of the long-term goal. And I would just like to comment on the last question that the chairman asked, and that is, as I look at cap and trade, I am a very strong supporter of CCS. We need legislation to do that, but the last thing that we want to do is embark on cap and trade without knowing whether, in fact, it's going to work for sure and is in place or not as those years commence. Mr. Crane, you made the comment that nuclear would be a lot easier than clean coal from your experience in New York, and I know that as you were embarking on a project in New York State, your CCS project virtually collapsed. The question that I have is, you said that this technology is promising, carbon capture, but it's not around the corner. How long do you think it is until it can be in place, whether it's using Mr. Alex's technology, or when is the date that we can look at it?
Well, I'm actually not a technology. I think we're ready to go forward with scale demonstration projects right now. I think every element of the CCS chain is ready to go at scale, whether it's with Frank's technology and we have carbon pipelines down on the Gulf Coast in Mississippi and up in the Big Sky country. So no, I'm a big believer it's ready to go. But in New York State, it wasn't that we didn't think that we knew how to do it. It was just too expensive. Keep in mind that the greatest stimulant in the electric industry to doing other things, apart from having money available from Wall Street, of which there's none for anything, is high natural gas prices. So in a low natural gas price environment, the trouble that you see with clean coal, solar, wind, everything is that the price of natural gas is now so low that that's by far the cheapest way of producing electricity.
Were there liability concerns in New York as well, or not?
Yes. No, liability, would the carbon, migrate underground, and we had the geological studies to show that it would stay very contained, and it did not pose a threat, but there's a big difference between having that in a study and making people comfortable. And we didn't even get out into the public with that. That's just making the public policymakers comfortable.
Dr. Duncan, I know that Texas is not a Great Lakes state. How do you get away with or how do you proceed with the liability issues in Texas as it relates to groundwater and the whole NIMBY factor? Is there a special law that Texas has that other states or in Oklahoma may have that we don't have in places like New York and Michigan?
Well, there are some differences in the common law tradition in Texas that are different to other states. I think that the attitude in Texas was portrayed when the Texas legislature voted unanimously to take on the liability related to Future Gen's CO2. And so I think there's a high degree of comfort in Texas, both amongst the general public and legislators, as to the safety and efficacy of CO2 injection, which comes from the long record that we have there. During the Future Gen project, I was out in the communities where we were considering Future Gen sites, and I think that there was a large degree of public acceptance. We found that there was a negative reaction towards new coal power plants that didn't have CCS, but there was a high degree of acceptance of carbon capture and storage.
Last year there were certainly a lot of us that were encouraged that we would actually move the CCS legislation that Mr. Boucher and many of us were co-sponsors of. Have each of you had a chance to look at that legislation, and what comments would you have as we look to have it move this year in terms of changes that we might want to make to that legislation? Anybody have a suggestion? Mr. Hawkins?
We did review Mr. Boucher's legislation and commented favorably on it last year. This year, we think it would be a good contributor to what we would call a two-track proposal on CCS. Deployment is the top priority. Some of the concepts that are in the Boucher legislation would provide additional resources for research that could be done along with that deployment to advance some of the technologies that are further behind.
I know my time has expired, so I'll ask my last questions, which may not require an affirmative answer. Is anyone on the panel against our legislation?
No, we
Thank you.
We favor
It's
it.
a good answer.
Great. Gentleman's
I
time.
yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted, for all the panelists, just first, given the power makeup of the United States today and for the near future, and giving the power makeup for developing countries like China and India, is there anybody here on the panel that thinks we can meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals without widespread development of CCS technology? Is there a way to do this without CCS? Does anybody think that? So it's critical that this technology be developed and deployed if we're going to have any chance of meeting these targets. Now, here's my question for all of you. I heard Mr. Hawkins said that this technology is ready to go today. I've seen television commercials that says it's a complete myth and doesn't exist and won't be ready for 50 years. And I heard all of you talk a little bit about it, but I still don't have a clear, could each of you tell me in your opinions how long you think, how many years are we talking about till we have widespread deployment where we can go to our coal-fired utility plants here in this country and start to export this technology to countries like China and that? Are we 10 years away from that? Are we 20 years away from that? Is it ready today, or is it a myth? Could each of you just tell me what your opinion of that is? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Doyle, I think what I would say is that with respect to the question of readiness, it's ready today. My view is that if comprehensive climate legislation were enacted, we would see contracts for the first commercial scale projects being firmed up within months, less than a year from enactment. That's my view. In terms of widespread deployment, that's more difficult to predict. But in terms, we build power plants one at a time, and the first ones could be online within the normal construction time path of a power plant without carbon capture and disposal, if you get the legislation and the economic conditions to support it.
Mr. Crane?
My view is that the quickest way to go forward, and I agree with David's timetable, is to split the carbon capture and the sequestration. Prove up post-carbon capture and combine it with enhanced oil recovery. You can do that now. Frank's technology is one of the leaders, scale up to the 100 megawatt size. Prove up sequestration sides by just putting off-the-shelf gasifiers from the chemical industry on top of the geological formations that you want to prove it in. And if you do that, you can be going within a year, and you can prove it up over the next, 5 years, and you can be exporting, at scale, within a decade. And
so in a decade, you think we can be to scale and deploy these?
Yeah, and the huge market here obviously is all the newer coal plants, not the 50-year-old coal plants in the United States, which are reaching the end of their useful life anyway.
Right. Mr. Duncan?
I believe from a technical viewpoint and a technological viewpoint, we're ready to start now. I think there's some policy issues and regulatory issues that need to be worked out.
Yeah, assuming the policy and regulatory issues are worked out, I think 3 to 4 years in a build cycle is about right. And we, as both Mr. Hawkins and Mr. Crane said, we're ready to go. So really the financial incentives have to be in place, and we can see commercial units come online 2012, 2013. And then I would think a year or two online is sufficient to demonstrate that it's commercially ready at any scale. So I'm a little bit more optimistic. I would say by 2015, we should be ready to do this everywhere at whatever scale is needed if we get going in the next year with the incentives needed to get commercial scale units deployed.
Very good.
My understanding, the consensus would be that on widespread deployment, commercial deployments, 2020 to 2025 for CCS. That's not to say there can't be breakthroughs that some of the panelists have just mentioned that can accelerate that even beyond.
You're saying the year 2020. You're not saying 20 to 25 years.
No, year 2020,
okay.
Between year 2020 and 2025 for widespread commercial deployment.
Mm-hmm.
I think the timeframes which have been outlined are consistent with our understanding from the insurance industry perspective. At Zurich in January of this year, we announced the availability of insurance capital that's immediately deployable in this context. And in fact, we have been asked to and have provided an indication for coverage already. So from my perspective, not only is this technology technically ready to go, but there are indications in the marketplace that the business is ready to go.
Very good. So basically the consensus here is certainly within the decade or shortly thereafter would be ready for widespread deployment of this technology. Is that what I'm hearing? Okay, thank you very much. I think that's important to have in the record.
Thank you. Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask unanimous consent to put two documents in the record for this hearing. Both are from the Energy Information Administration. One is the last updated price of coal per short ton in the United States. It's February of 2009. The other is a chart of coal prices per kilowatt hour by state that is from the EIA, and it's January of 2007.
Without objection, it will be included.
And the reason I put those two documents, thank you, Mr. Chairman, the reason I put those two documents in the record is because we're having a nice, warm, touchy-feely discussion about CCS and all that, and I'm on the voucher bill. I'm supportive of it. But consumers make decisions based on price, and utilities make decisions on what kind of plants to build based on the price of the fuel. If I heard Mr. Alex correctly, he said that his technology is going to cost $40 a ton of CO2, which is the equivalent of $120 a ton of coal. So the base load price of coal in the United States, according to the EIA, is around between $26 and $30 a ton. So he's just added 400% to the cost of coal, if I understand him correctly. Now, Mr. Doyle asked the question, and it's a good question, does anybody think that we can meet all of our environmental challenges without using CCS technology for coal? And y'all all answered no. But the real answer is yes. You don't use coal. You use natural gas, or you use nuclear, or you use some other alternative. Natural gas prices are falling like a rock. Last month in Texas, in the Barnett Shale, which is partially in my district, you could buy all the natural gas you wanted at about between $4 and $5 a 1,000 cubic feet. Now, there's a formation up through Pennsylvania and New York called the Marseilles Shale. It is estimated that it has so much natural gas, it could have 500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Now, to put that in perspective, we use about 22 trillion cubic feet of natural gas a year. The Barnett Shale, which is the largest new producing formation of natural gas in the world, last year produced about 1 trillion cubic feet. So we have this formation up in Pennsylvania and New York that has so much natural gas potentially that we can't even estimate how much we have. So there is a way to do this without using coal. But having said that, I think we need to use coal. Now, my question to Mr. Crane and to Mr. Alex, if we really study this CCS under Mr. Boucher's bill, what's a reasonable expectation of how much lower you can get the cost of this technology so that it really is cost competitive with natural gas and nuclear? Mr. Crane.
It's not clear to us that it's the house load of post-combustion carbon capture. It's difficult to see from an engineering perspective how it ever gets below sort of taking up 20% of the production of the power plant itself. So while we expect
it takes that much electricity just to run the technology.
Yes.
20% of the output.
Yes.
Okay.
So our view is that Mr. Alex's $40 a ton. I mean, can it get down to $30 a ton? Maybe it can. We don't believe it'll ever go.
That's per ton of CO2.
Yeah, per ton of CO2. We don't believe it'll ever get to. It's not. The economies are such that we don't believe it ever gets to $5 a ton or $10 a ton. So it becomes an inconsequential portion of the whole. When you talk about the cost of carbon as for a coal-fired power plant, on a delivered basis, $40 a ton is a little bit more than doubling the cost of coal, because the $8 a ton of coal that you're talking about, of course, is up in Wyoming. You still have to get it, to where you're using it. So it's a big adder, but maybe not quite as large as you said. But the issue with gas is that if it turns out that the country has an infinite amount of gas in these shale formations, then probably the future for coal isn't that great anyway. But I think all of us in the power generation industry remember what happened the last time the power industry plunged wholesale into gas, which was that the price of gas went from $3 per million BTU to $15, last June. So, I think we really think there needs to be a balance. And
I agree with that.
I know that you agree with that.
I agree with that. My time's, could I let Mr. Alex answer?
Please, yes.
How low can you bring the cost of your technology if you really refine it and expand it? And
I think we're looking at between $20 and $30 a ton as a reasonable goal based on what we know today for an advanced coal plant. I think that adds about 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour if you look at advanced coal plants. I think it's important to note that natural gas plants have about half the CO2 of a coal plant, so CO2 emissions from natural gas plants would not be free under a cap-and-trade bill, and they would increase as well. So under many scenarios, we've seen even adding that 2 to 3 cents per kilowatt hour to coal. If you look at gas historically more in the 8 to 10 per million BTU, and the CO2 emissions of gas, coal still remains quite competitive.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Matheson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the panel as well. We may have covered this a little bit in Mr. Barton's questioning. I just want to say one of my concerns about moving too quickly on climate change in terms of whether the key technologies are really developed or not. You've heard, in fact, a lot of the members on the panel ask you questions about when's this going to be ready? When are we going to be viable? But beyond being viable, I guess the question is how much is it really going to cost? You know, 2 years ago, a witness for the subcommittee noted that new technologies at that point predicted the total cost of a new coal-fired plant would increase by 60 to 70%. Do these new costs, what level of concern do you have about the potential cost impacts if we're going to employ carbon capture and sequestration? I just asked that to the panel in general. How much do these new costs concern you?
Well, I pay electricity bills, and so I can certainly relate to the concerns about costs. What I would say is that the first generation of these plants is likely to cost more, and the percentage increase that you're describing is what's called the production cost of electricity. That's not going to translate into that kind of a price rise in retail electricity prices for several reasons. First, coal is half of the power production in the U.S. Second, production cost is about 60% of the electricity bill you pay. But most importantly, we're not going to deploy this technology on all 330 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants overnight. It's going to happen gradually. The first ones are going to be somewhat clunky. I remember the first portable computer that I had. It was about the size of a carry-on bag on an airline, and it had a lot less computing power than this cell phone. So we're going to get better at this, and we're going to get better faster if we start right away.
Do people think cap-and-trade legislation, that there's going to be a way to provide cost mitigation to consumers that feel this? Is that a piece of this equation as well?
U.S. cap blueprint is to provide cost mitigation through through some of the proceeds from the auction through to the hard-pressed consumers.
I would suggest that doing so is more complicated than it sounds. About half the states in this country have primary reliance on coal as their electric fuel source. About half the states don't. And one of the concerns I have, coming from one of those states that's around 90% of its electricity comes from coal, is we're going to have a regional wealth transfer, if you will, in this country based on who pays more on the utility bills and how the cost mitigation funds are directed to consumers who are affected by it. So I don't know if anyone on the panel has expertise on that issue, but I would just suggest to you that this is a lot more complicated than people are making it out to be, I think, in terms of how you do cost mitigation in a fair and equitable way. Let me move to, I mentioned the midterm action, I mentioned that quote earlier. The witness from the 2007 hearing was Jeff Sturba, who's CEO of PNM Resources. I know he can't be here today, but at that same hearing in 2007, he said that it is only through the steady and judicious advancement of these applications during the course of the next decade we can start to bring the costs down. It seems to me we have a long way to go in terms of making the advances we need to make between 2007 and 2017. You know, we thought we made some progress in the legislation that passed Congress in 2007, the Energy Independence and Security Act. But from the policymaker side of the equation, what more do we need to be doing? I mean, I'm a co-sponsor of last Congress's, the voucher bill, as you've heard before. Is that the approach we need to take? What are your suggestions policy-wise for how we can move this technology along?
Well, can I, just even on your regional wealth transfer point, I agree with you that there's the potential for that, and right now, absent support for clean coal in particular, but also for nuclear, there'll be a wealth transfer to the parts of the country that have more solar, wind resources or more gas-fired generation than ones that depend on coal and nuclear. And so, you know, we think all of those technologies, solar, wind, gas, nuclear, and clean coal, need to be supported. So I'd say that, to answer your last question, what you can be doing is exactly what you're talking about, which is, you know, early funding to get clean coal going, because that's definitely the laggard of all of those technologies right now in terms of, you know, ready for commercial deployment. So to prevent that regional wealth transfer, I think pushing forward the way you are is the way to go.
And I would add, we would recommend this U.S. CAP blueprint, which has a series of proposals to address all the concerns that you mentioned, both in terms of regional impacts and in terms of a serious program to deploy carbon capture and disposal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess after hearing all this testimony and reading, I'm not particularly optimistic about carbon capture and sequestration myself, but I noticed recently, Mr. Hawkins, that the NRDC, in partnership with Alliance for Climate Protection, produced some TV ads, and they'd focused on an employee of a plant using coal, and basically the commercial ends with a caption stating, "In reality, there is no such thing as clean coal." Now, does that ad, does that apply to a plant using CCS or not?
Well, unfortunately, it does today, and that's the reason that we co-sponsored these ads. Today, we don't have a commercial-scale electric power plant in the United States that is using carbon capture and disposal.
But you would be supportive of the coal industry if it did have CCS in a commercial?
As I've testified, NRDC is a strong supporter of CCS deployment, and we've supported it for a number of years now and continue to support it. We would like to be able to run an ad very soon saying, in reality, there is such a thing as coal with carbon capture.
Now, say by the year 2030, just from the NRDC's perspective, what would you like to see the fuel mix used worldwide to produce electricity, say, by 2030?
We don't think that it's appropriate for Congress or for an organization like ours to dictate the fuel mix. We think it is important for the Congress to set criteria for environmental performance, and we think the environmental performance of the global power sector has to be a lot better in terms of carbon dioxide pollution than it is today. You say by 2030, globally we should be trying to reduce emissions on the order of 30% or more. In the United States, we would like to see reductions on the order of 40% or more, reflecting our large historic contributions to the CO2 in the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Patton, one of the issues relating to commercial use of carbon capture and storage certainly relates to liability issues, and you touched on insurance policies in your testimony. But from a liability side of this, I mean, companies that are first using commercial grade CCS and storing this, the post-injection liability issue, is that something that you all are willing to cover, or?
Absolutely. Our customers came to us and asked us for some assistance, specifically in managing risk associated with carbon sequestration, especially the post-injection issues. From our perspective, we evaluated the existing suite of technologies in this case, and as I indicated in my written testimony, we announced the availability in January of 2 policies that are designed to provide liability coverage during the operational closure and post-closure periods. The first policy addresses the core risks which were identified to us as unique for the sequestration activity. So clearly existing in the insurance industry already, there was capital available to address construction liability associated with constructing capture-ready facilities. With respect to the injection component, our customers identified 5 areas which we developed a policy around. They were concerned about pollution liability for underground sequestration activity. So what would happen, as Dr. Duncan noted, if there was a migration of stored CO2 into groundwater? Our policy does respond to that. They were concerned about liabilities associated with transportation, whether that was the short distance or long distance. Our policies respond to that. With respect to injection activities itself, potentially that a well could go out of control, we were able to respond to that. There was concern about geomechanical events. So basically the act of putting the gas into the ground causing a geomechanical event, a seismic event. We are able to respond and provide coverage for that. And finally, there were concerns about business interruption. What would happen if after this project was constructed, there were circumstances where the plant had to have a business interruption and they might have to buy carbon credits or some other equivalent in that process. We are prepared to extend coverage to address that during that period. The second area of policy looks at the specified activities that may be imposed by a permitting system if one is implemented, which will dictate the terms under which those facilities will be closed and released in a post-closure context. So what must an operator do to prove that that site is stable enough for a long-term stewardship. And we have a second policy which addresses those issues. So yes, we stand ready today to commit capital now for those applications.
Thank you. Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.
Thank you. My compliments to the panel, too. This has been one of the best panels. We've had about 24 hearings, and this has just been a great panel, and I have 1,000 questions. I'll just start with one to the whole panel. Does anyone believe that the coal industry has an ownership right in the atmosphere that gives it right to use the atmosphere? Does anybody believe that? No one said yes so far. Okay. Does anybody believe that the coal industry should have the right to put unlimited amounts of carbon dioxide at zero cost into the atmosphere? Does anybody believe that?
Congressman, I'm not sure the point of your question is whether the coal industry has that right. Aren't we just talking about whether society, in terms of how it operates?
That's a good point. Let me rephrase the question. Does anybody at the table believe that any industrial group, utility or coal-based using industry, have the right to put unlimited amounts of carbon dioxide, which is causing global warming, into the atmosphere at zero cost? Does anybody believe that? So far, nobody's...
Well, again,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr.
I just think the question is a little narrow, keeps invoking the coal industry. We're talking about society and economic activity, and there's a lot of different economic activity.
Well, let me just narrow it.
Has a carbon contribution.
You think a utility that has a coal plant that is spewing tons of CO2 into the atmosphere that is causing global warming, do you think that utility has a property right to put that CO2 into the atmosphere in unlimited amounts at zero cost? Does anybody believe that? Okay, nobody believes that. So there's a consensus that we should have a legal framework that does not allow that to happen. So now here's my next question on how to form that consensus. Does anybody believe that the costs of developing this technology that I think there's broad consensus in this room needs to be developed to figure out a way to sequester carbon dioxide? Does anybody believe that the cost of developing that technology should fall exclusively on the public, as opposed to those industrial entities that are using the coal, that are putting the CO2 into the atmosphere? In other words, does anybody believe that cost should be exclusively on the taxpayers who would have to fund that research? Okay, no one has said yes to that question. So that means there's someone else going to have to fund this research. So now I want to ask for your opinions about that. I have suggested, others on this committee have suggested, that we have a cap-and-trade system that auctions off the right to put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and uses at least a substantial portion of the auction revenues to go to research and development activities, some of which would be through the utilities that are actually doing this work. Some of this would be through the companies developing this coal generating technology. Some would be from academic institutions. But basically this fund would help fund this new technology. How many people think that, at least in part, is a good idea, that we fund this new technological development in part through, at least in part, through the auction revenues of a cap and trade system? I see a bunch of heads nodding. Why don't we just go down the table? How many people think that's a good idea in general? Let's start with.
I think there are multiple methods for doing funding. I think the critical issue is that there needs to be funding.
I think in part an auction would assist in providing the push through funding, but I think it's also important that we allocate any allowances properly to protect any economic dislocation, because after all, we're talking about businesses that are going to have to adjust their cost structures to increase energy supplies, and if you're going to make them pay more, some of their factories in your districts could be their last stop in the United States.
I would support in part funding CCS technology with auction revenue.
This issue is outside my field of expertise, but I'm in favor of funding.
We agree in part auction, but we know the government has many different uses for funds, and that often they don't end up in the place where we would agree with you.
We support funding for deployment of this technology. It could be done either through an auction, or it could be done through direct allocation of allowances, which would then be turned into money. So you can turn the allowances into money at the start of the process or one step down the chain, but it's important to get the funds there.
Thank you. And I just noticed, Mr. Doyle and I are working on a provision that would allow a partial distribution of permits to energy-intensive industries that compete in international commodities that would otherwise might have a difficulty of competing. So at least I am proposing the bulk of these auction revenues to go to develop these new technology, but that there be some assistance, if you will, to these energy-intensive industries. Thank you very much to all the panelists.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Crane, I think you had said your company, NRG, is the only company that's actually seeking a permit right now for nuclear plant. Is it, or what's it?
Well, no, I was just expressing a high level of confidence that we would be the first to build, but I think there are something like 24 companies that have filed permits. There are 14 that asked for the Department of Energy loan guarantees, and I think the Department of Energy is down to considering 5, and they'll pick 2 to 3.
And so you're close enough to where you think you're, do y'all have any timetable on when you would
close
get?
enough in the nuclear world.
Right.
Which means,
when do you think you would get that?
Well, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has published a schedule for our permit, which would call for us getting the permit in 2011, and that then if we proceed to build immediately, first unit would be online in 2016.
Now, how long has this process been going on for your company to try to get this?
Well, we were a late
start. And how much
does
does it cost?
We were a late start, and we moved fast, so it's been only 3 years for us so far. But keep in mind, we're permitting a nuclear design that's been previously designed certified by the NRC at a site that's been previously approved for 4 units and has 2 there now. So
It's not a new plan. It's not a new site, or it's not a new model that you're using.
Well, it's advanced. It's far newer than any other nuclear plant currently existing in the United States, thanks to the 30-year, lag. But it's not new by international standards.
And how much have you spent so far?
The application process has cost us close to $200 million.
What do you think the reasons are for that high cost? There are a
nuclear-
lot of barriers to entry, of course.
Nuclear
right now for
plants
nuclear
are
power.
complicated, and the NRC takes their safety mission exceedingly seriously, as they should. We have no criticism of the NRC in the way that they've been dealing with our application. It's just...
And I don't want to put you on a spot because you're waiting for them to approve this. It's but you've seen this across the country. There are many people, not mentioning you, but there are many companies that want to pursue nuclear, but consider barriers to entry, not just cost, but regulatory burdens in a proven technology. This is not something new. This is something that's been perfected. It's very widely used in Europe. They sure don't put those same types of barrier to entry and have been able to get a carbon-free energy product much more readily. It's much more widely used in other parts of the world.
I think the biggest barrier to entry to nuclear as a macroeconomic solution in the U.S. is that, I don't think in my lifetime there'll be a nuclear plant developed in the United States that's not at an existing site. And since there are roughly 60-some existing sites, and probably half of them they can't have expansion for various reasons, it limits, the limiting factor for nuclear as a solution is siting, long term.
Yeah. Mr. Hawkins, I think you've talked about, and I'll let you explain your real feelings on it, but in terms of coal, I think you've called for a moratorium on coal facilities, if you can expand.
We have said that new coal plants should be built with carbon capture and disposal.
And so you're saying that technology is not available today, though, right?
No, we're saying the technology is available today, but the policies are not there to require it or to create an economic incentive for it.
When would you foresee that being in place where a facility could be built that would have that technology?
Well, Chairman Waxman has said he wants to get a bill out of his committee by Memorial Day. If that happens and if the Senate moves, it could be before the end of this year.
And how long would it take then to get those facilities built? And that's assuming a lot of things, but.
Well, a coal-fired power plant takes 3, 4, 5 years to build, and as soon as the policy signals are straight, I think, as I said before, you'd see contracts written, and 3, 4, 5 years after that, you'd see projects that could come online with this technology.
We've had hearings on a number of the renewables. I think we all support the continued development of those renewables to get them at a place where they could be even more reliable. I think the estimates I've seen on wind and solar is you could maybe get 20 on the high end, 30% of your grid in electricity generated through those methods, and everybody acknowledges that even then it's not a continuous source, and so you would need backup power supplies and another method of providing continuous power, because when we turn on our lights, of course, we're not going to just have the lights be on when the wind's blowing, and so you have to have that backup. How do you, even if under those scenarios you laid out, how would you suggest solving that problem of the fact that you don't have a continuous source just by using renewables?
Well, as I said, we don't propose a system that is 100% renewables. We think that the most likely electricity system in the U.S. in the next several decades is going to be a mix of renewables,
mix of coal,
fossil,
of nuclear, of gas.
A mix of the technologies that we have today. With respect to renewables, I think we will see the development of storage technologies which will make renewables and the intermittent nature of renewables much less of an issue than it is today.
I think I'm out of time. So.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Boucher.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to commend you on organizing our discussion this morning on the future of coal. It is a critically important conversation for us to have as we consider cap-and-trade legislation, direct funding legislation for carbon capture and sequestration, and other measures that are related to climate change. And I agree with Mr. Rensley. This has been one of the more productive conversations we have had in this subcommittee very recently. The Electric Power Research Institute, widely regarded for its expertise in energy technology, tells us that if we had a dedicated funding stream of approximately $1 billion per year for a 10-year period, that at the end of that 10-year period, by approximately 2020, we would have available, reliable, and affordable carbon capture and sequestration technology available. And very shortly, within a matter now of just a couple of days, as has been mentioned in the course of our discussion today, bipartisan legislation that would achieve that funding schedule and put those dollars in place for research, development, and demonstration for carbon capture and sequestration will be introduced. I've heard some interesting testimony today from a number of the members about perhaps there being carbon capture and sequestration technologies available in the nearer term. And I would like to explore that for just a moment. And I would ask for relatively brief answers to these questions because I have another train of questions I would also like to ask. My sense, and I'd like your reaction to this, is that it is possible, certainly today, for a CO2 emitting facility to install carbon capture and sequestration technology. That would be possible, for example, if you're sitting on top of an oil field and you're using a gasification technology, which is well understood and, as Mr. Crane indicated, has been in commercial application in the chemical industry now for a number of years. And you're simply injecting that carbon dioxide directly into the gas or oil field. In fact, that's happening today in Canada at Rayburn with natural gas that is with CO2 that's being generated from a coal-fired power plant. I think it is in one of our Great Plains northern states. But there are some challenges, and that's what the funding is designed to address. First of all, we really don't have storage caverns other than oil and gas fields well characterized for CO2 sequestration. Secondly, we don't have post-combustion technologies that are at hand for CO2 separation. There is an older amine technology, but improvements are on the way that will yield a larger suite of technologies, including chilled ammonia, including oxygen firing, and other processes that will make far more reliable, available, and affordable that full suite of CCS technologies. And it is the need for that, the characterization of fields other than oil and gas, that being salt caverns or perhaps unminable coal seams. It is the need for these next generation technologies for CO2 capture that it is essential we provide this funding for. So let me just ask if there's general agreement with the statement that I've just made about the need for this legislation directed toward those objectives. Mr. Crane?
Well, Congressman, I agree with you completely. I just be careful if you get the money, who's dispensing it, because you're going to need someone with a bit of an entrepreneurial bent. You know, and the DOE has traditionally been exceedingly conservative in the way that they've
Thank you. I appreciate the answer that we need to do it. And we do have in our legislation a comprehensive mechanism involving broad participation in the policy making about how it would be distributed.
Yeah.
Mr. Hawkins, would you care to comment?
My view, Mr. Boucher, is that you would get a lot more bang for your buck if your legislation were incorporated into climate legislation that will make sure that the private sector is motivated to spend this money as effectively as possible to deliver results as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hawkins. Mr. Quinn, would you care to comment?
Congressman, I agree totally with your statement, and we are supportive of your legislation.
All right. Does anyone have a different view? Okay, I'll take that as essentially unanimous agreement from the group. Mr. Hawkins, I would welcome your advice on the fundamental difference between research, development, and demonstration on the one hand, which government typically funds because these are large-scale projects, oftentimes beyond the scope of private industry in order to finance, and the deployment of that technology once it is developed on the other hand. And my sense about how that division should be drawn is that the larger scale, longer term projects are deserving of government funding, perhaps through a mechanism such as the legislation we're about to introduce that would speed those dollars to it. And then when it comes to deployment, that should be a shared responsibility between the polluting, well, I don't want to use that word, between the emitting sector, the industry that is emitting, and the government, perhaps through a mechanism in our cap and trade legislation that would devote revenues from whatever share of the allowances we decide to auction toward that purpose. Would that be essentially the right division?
Yes, sir. The U.S. has supported deployment of critical technologies in the past. The interstate highway system is one such example. And I think that one can say that with respect to the electricity sector, support for deployment is a reasonable thing to do for energy security reasons and to attack this critical problem of climate change.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hawkins. Ms. Patton, one question for you as my time expires. I am very encouraged to see that the insurance industry is now offering products to insure against liability, short-term, long-term, operation closure, post-closure, for those who inject carbon dioxide for sequestration purposes. And that tends to resolve some of the issues that we've discussed over the last several years about that liability and who's going to bear it. Now the industry potentially can bear it because they'll have insurance against it. What I think is absent from this conversation is the cost of that insurance. And can you give us a sense of what the premium is on the policy that you're now offering, perhaps in terms of the unit of dollars or cents, I suppose, per ton of carbon dioxide that is stored?
In short, the answer is, in the absence of a specific submission, unfortunately, no, not in the amount of time that I have available.
So in other words, you have a product available, price to be determined.
It's priced based on the geologic conditions that are present, and to the extent that we've provided indications to customers, they have indicated that they can absorb that within their business model.
All right, so they have found it to be affordable.
Affirmative.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. We have a health subcommittee meeting going on, met with local county officials, so you know I would rather be here 100% of the time, so I apologize for not being here. A couple things. One is I would part of the memo from committee staff talks about, and I think Mr. Hawkins, you referenced the fact that there's no really movement on fossil fuel in the capital market section. I would submit that it's more a fear of politics than the fear of that fear is putting a high risk on raising capital for this because we're uncertain and we're not moving in a direction. In fact, I would talk about the new appointee to the as Secretary of Health and Human Services, Governor Sebelius, who 3 times vetoed legislation for a coal-fired power plant in the state of Kansas. That's the signals that are going out there in the community that, and added by, I know Mr. Whitfield talked about your ads that there is no clean coal, right? And I would add, based upon your website, you say there's no such thing as clean coal, even with carbon capture and sequestration. That uncertainty provides exactly what you all want, is fear in the markets to move projects. Now, fortunately in Illinois, we haven't fallen to those fears. I just talked about the ConocoPhillips refinery expansion. I've got the Prairie State campus that's employing thousands of workers. In fact, it is taking the jobs of laid-off steel workers because of this economy and putting the work in the power plant now in my district. We have Taylorville, Illinois. We have Decatur, Illinois. So I would say that we need to get this right, and we need to bring certainty, and it's the politicians who are doing this. Mr. Chairman, I would like to, for the record, also submit the Wall Street Journal editorial from yesterday, which raises the issue who pays for cap and trade. And you know who pays? The Midwest. Mr. Doyle, it's going to be Pennsylvania. It's going to be Virginia. It's going to be Louisiana. It's going to be Illinois. It's going to be those fossil fuel states who are going to be paying to really, it's a transfer of wealth from the Midwest to the coastal states. And if you would allow it to be submitted, Mr. Chairman, I would appreciate, I think it adds to this debate on the whole cap and trade regime.
Without objection, the Wall Street editorial mentioning my name will be included in.
You're in here. I didn't know that. I didn't read that far down, Mr. Chairman. You're always one step ahead of me. I want to go, Mr. Crane, I think you made a critical point on the nuclear power and expansions. I agree with you 100%. That site selection is a limiting factor. I wish the environmental community would get on board with helping us expand nuclear power. Let me address this current question as far as Yucca Mountain and high-level nuclear storage. If we don't address the nuclear storage issue, does that inhibit the ability of expansion on-site for nuclear power?
I don't think so. I mean, whether Yucca Mountain goes forward or not is a decision you all make. That's above my pay scale. We proceeded with nuclear development on the view that dry cask storage on-site would be good for 1 or 2 centuries. So,
but you'd have to get permission to expand. There are nuclear power plants right now that, in their current siting, they are almost at capacity.
Yeah, and I hate to be parochial, but that's someone else's problem. Our nuclear power plant is on 15,000 acres.
Okay, but if you're talking about the expansion of nuclear power, so what's not good for you, what's not good for your competitors, But nuclear power, which is important for the country to meet these caps, I hope that in this you would think better of the country than just your shareholders.
Well, no, I mean, certainly as an American, I'm a huge proponent of nuclear power, and I think it ties directly with the electric car, which is, I think, a service that nuclear power is tied to. The siting question, though, and the nuclear storage question, there, again, that's more of a political public policy issue. I mean,
well, and guess what? You're in front of politicians in the debate on public policy, and the Yucca Mountain debate is a current debate on how we deal with this. And there are nuclear power plants that are at capacity that will either have to expand their on-site storage, and of course, the state of Illinois is a big nuclear power state with 11 reactors in suburbia. My colleague who chairs this talks about the threat and the risk. However, we never seem to address the threat and the risk of major metropolitan areas that have nuclear power facilities while we keep high-level nuclear waste right in the backyards of suburbia. Mr. Chairman, I could go on for more, but my time's out, and I don't want to push the limits. I yield back.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman very much. And just a brief correction here that unless something has gone terribly, terribly wrong in the private sector, Mr. Crane, that decision on nuclear waste storage is actually way below your pay grade. Okay, we make that note for the record. Let me turn now and recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stern.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman turn on his microphone? No, it is not working. Perhaps the gentleman can move over to Mr. Pitts's microphone. We want the television cameras to pick up everything that's said in this hearing.
Well, I'm closer, so let me make This could be a signal.
Maybe you could use the chairman's chair.
Cliff, are you still ranking on telco?
It did just work.
See if I can get through this and perhaps speak a little louder. I had the opportunity to participate in transatlantic dialogue with the European Union. And I get lots of information from those meetings we over in Europe and then over here in the United States. And recently I read that the European Commissioner for Energy last November said that coal with CCS, the carbon capture sequestration, is the low-cost, low-carbon alternative. Reports published by the European Commission and the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, last year make the direct statements that A, the cost of achieving European climate goals could be 40% higher without CCS, the EC, and B, the cost of mitigation without CCS is 71% greater than coal with CCS. Given that position, is there an opportunity for large-scale cooperation with the EU on large public-private CCS partnerships? So, Mr. Quinn and Mr. Hawkins?
Congressman, I think so, and I think it was the IEA who actually made the statement that in the long term that coal with CCS will be the low-carbon, most affordable low-carbon energy source for the world. There are, perhaps some of the panelists have better information than I do, but there are sequestration demonstration projects currently proceeding in Europe. There are some American companies participating in Asia with carbon capture and storage projects in China. So there are opportunities, and those, I think they are underway in terms of those types of partnerships.
Mr. Hawkins?
I would agree that there's great potential in these partnerships. Actually, I'm going to Europe on Saturday to have conversations in Brussels with European legislators about this very thing. In addition to Europe, China, Australia are other places where this kind of work could pay off big benefits.
Anyone else like to comment on it? Yes.
We've also been to Europe and been asked to compete for projects in Europe and Australia. So I think the initiatives are international in scope in terms of trying to bring the best technology to bear on the problem.
A study by a collaboration of both unions and industry leaders published last month estimate that 5 to 7 million jobs would be created during the construction process of CCS facilities, and that 250,000 permanent jobs would be needed in order to operate these facilities. With that said, in your opinion, what is needed to jumpstart the CCS technology industry to ensure widespread commercial deployment of the technology, and what can Congress do to make these jobs a reality? The same two individuals, perhaps. Mr. Quinn?
Well, Congressman, I think what we've heard today is there's two things. We need a push. Congressman Boucher's legislation provides part of that push in terms of sustained funding source for this technology. There probably also what we've heard today is that there needs to be a framework that establishes some certainty. It's a balanced framework in terms of carbon management. It provides the certainty we need to build out our existing coal-based generation source. Part of the discussion today has been about some of that uncertainty. Mr. Shimskis raised it. Uncertainty is in terms of technology, operational uncertainty, and public policy uncertainty are all the enemy of investment and capital investment.
What do you think are the biggest hurdles to reaching a CCS commercialization?
Well, we have three pieces there. We have the technology in terms of capture and use. And that, from what I've heard today, it sounds like we have very promising demo projects and pilot projects underway or close to be underway. Scaling those up and to be applied and integrated into commercially available electricity generation platforms, still there's a ways to go on that, and particularly in terms of the economics. You know, the transportation segment, transporting that to a storage facility, and then the siting for storage and what's suitable for siting. And I think on the last part, there's quite a bit of study going underway that sounds very promising, but I'll defer to Dr. Duncan in terms of the status of that. But and there's probably the issue that Ms. Patton talked about in terms of the how we assess and underwrite the risk for long-term for that type of storage. So there's a number of different hurdles there we have to get to, but I'm very confident that in the time horizons we talked about today that we'll overcome those and there'll be tremendous breakthroughs.
Mr. Hawkins?
In terms of what Congress can do, again, I'd hold up for the cameras the U.S. CAP blueprint. It provides a cap on emissions, and it provides a very structured program to get carbon capture and disposal systems into the market, emission standards and financial incentives to make sure that these first projects are economically affordable to build and fold into our power system.
Mr. Duncan, is there anything you'd like to add to this before I close?
Yes, thanks. I think that a number of the statements being made about cost of CCS and gas prices are a little misleading. First, all of the prices with regard to carbon capture are referred to retrofits of post-combustion capture. Capture can be much cheaper if you do it through an IGC plant or through oxy-firing through new builds rather than just retrofitting. Another thing, if I might add just quickly, is the comments on natural gas prices and the Barnett Shale and so on were very misleading because those gas productions will not continue under current gas prices, and the average lifetime of a Barnett or Marcellus Shale well is about 9 months in terms of its productivity. So gas prices are going to go higher.
Good point. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Unfortunately, yes. Very clearly.
I just didn't want you to cut me off like you did my friend from Florida there. I'm from a fossil fuel state, and I realize the importance of technology to address CCS, and I support nuclear power totally and completely. Clean coal, of course. But, you know, I also recognize the presence of a thing that some of you seem to forget, and that's the presence of a cash register. You know, China doesn't really want to go by the cash register. And you can, Mr. Hawkins, hold up all the periodicals that you have there in your whole briefcase, and you can't force China to change their mind. They're not only refusing to participate financially in the cleanup, but they're deteriorating daily and weekly, as has been testified to here. None of you objected to that or disagreed with it. And about the same thing can be said for Russia, Mexico, India, and go right on down the line. They just don't want to talk about the cash register. That's too plain, and that's something that the American people can understand. You know, I'm a little bit sick of all the self-serving to a worn-out determination to push and rush to judgment when, you know, you don't even say global warming anymore. You're saying global change. And, of course, we have to have global change. And we ought to have technology. We ought to be addressing it. And this young lady over here can give you a quick policy of insurance, the old line, legal reserve, non-cancelable, I'm positive, on global change. Now, I wonder if that would also include global freezing. Sometime up here, I'm about as afraid of global freezing as I am global warming. But you all don't seem to notice that. And I guess that in the question by Mr. Ansley from Washington about unlimited amount of carbon dioxide, who has a right to do all that into the atmosphere, and whether or not, and I would really like to ask Ms. Patton a question, but I think it'd take too long to answer it, about your policy and how you arrive at a policy to insure against, and what do you insure against on global warming? An occasion? Just yes or no. You insure the happening or the non-happening of an occasion, right?
We insure the happening of a triggering event, which
okay, and I think you might have meant a geomechanical event. And would that, to get to be more plain and something in American that I could understand, does that mean devastating? Is there something in the small print that describes what your mechanical
a geomechanical
might
event
be?
Yeah,
Would you? Well, let me ask you. Do you? Would that be when the Statue of Liberty is underwater, or the Sahara Desert becomes the Sahara Ocean, or what mechanical event has to happen before it triggers your payoff?
Mr. Hall, in response to what coverage we're providing for the geomechanical issues, the covered event would be a resultant earthquake from the injection of gas.
You have a board that can insure against earthquakes?
If, in fact, the CCS injection, the injection of the carbon dioxide, does cause that event, we are prepared to pay in response for any consequential property damage.
I'm pleased to know that you exist, and that do you sell many policies in China?
We do offer coverage in China, however.
I'm pulling
this
for you.
This particular coverage is not momentarily
I'll get
available.
to my question before Mr. Markey turns me off like he did the guy from Florida here. I like Mr. Markey. Don't misunderstand me. I just don't like the way he votes. He's killed my vote for 28 years up here. Mr. Quinn, in your testimony, you state that coal is not merely important to the United States and the world. It's indispensable for meeting our energy needs for the foreseeable future, and I sure agree with you to that effect. I'm big on coal. Not only that, but coal could provide 125,000 direct high-paying jobs for the U.S. coal miners and supports hundreds of thousands of additional jobs throughout the value chain and in companies and manufacturing operations that depend on reliable coal-based electricity to keep their energy costs down, and Mr. Barton alluded to that. Now, what will happen if if we stop using coal-fired generation, or we arbitrarily raise the price of coal-fired generation through cap and trade?
Well, if the wrong policy is chosen and coal is adversely impacted, then those jobs will be gone. Those jobs happen to be the highest paying jobs in many of those regions, including in your state of Texas as well.
Do any of the other of you four who said yes, 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 have a different answer to that? I presume that you don't. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. By unanimous consent, Mr. Terry, who is not a member of this subcommittee, will be recognized to ask questions.
I appreciate, is this on? Yeah. Mr. Hawkins, in your booklet, the plan, does it state where the cap should be placed on CO2 emissions, at what level?
It does.
And what is that?
There are targets for 2012, for 2020, for 2030, and for 2050. And
for 2012, what would that be?
it's a range of between 97% of 2005 levels to 102% of 2005 levels. So basically bracketing 2005 levels.
Very good. Then the follow-up question would be to Mr. Crane and Mr. Alex. For a coal-fired plant in Omaha, Nebraska, sitting on the Missouri River, 500 megawatts, does technology exist that allows them to comply to the cap by 2012?
To take the carbon, to comply by not emitting the carbon as opposed to
Right, at that plant?
No.
Not starting up a new one and shutting down the current one?
My opinion is that the technology will not be ready so that by 2012, a 500 megawatt flue gas stream could all be 90% carbon captured, but Mr. Alex may have a different point.
No, I would agree with that. I'd say it's available to confidently predict you can deploy it by that time frame. I'd say it's not ready yet. It's available to demonstrate. It's not commercially proven.
And by 2012, will it be commercially proven, in your opinion?
The current commercial
That gives us 3
demonstration
years.
project we have on track should be running in 2012. Generally, people want a year of operation to say it's commercially proven. So I would say on that track by 2013, you might suggest it's commercially proven at that point.
Okay, so perhaps maybe part of our discussion is not only what the level of the cap should be in a cap and trade, but also what year it should take effect. Would any of you support or feel that a trigger that the technology exists before the cap would be enforced is a reasonable position? Any of you have an opinion on that?
Well, I have an opinion. I think it's a classic chicken and egg situation that you cannot wait for the technology to be proven or to put the cap and trade system in place, or else it'll never happen. Certainly that's been our history of progress over the last 10 years, is there's been actually very little progress made in that regard. So, I think you have to set the target out there and then set the private sector working with the government out there to get after it.
I'm curious, I'm sorry, you wanted to say something?
Well, I just would add that I think Mr. Crane makes some good points, but I think it's important to know that we shouldn't be picking a time frame that's arbitrary and then saying hopefully the technology catch up. So somehow there's got to be integration in terms of figuring out what the time frame is based on what we know right now or in the near future about when that will be commercially available. And that's different than commercially, it's been commercially tested. I mean, widely available commercially is a whole different animal.
Very good. I think that's an excellent point. Do any of you, again, probably Mr. Crane or Mr. Alex, have any idea or opinion about what the cost to the utility would be around 2012 to retrofit their coal-fired plant to be able to meet the requirements of the cap? What those costs would be? Ballpark, we're guessing here, but give me a educated ballpark.
We've done a number of studies, both for retrofit and new at commercial scale, 500 to 760 megawatts, and they indicate capture costs in the vicinity at large-scale plants of $30 a ton. When you add in sequestration, if it's enhanced oil recovery, you may recoup some of those costs. If you have to pay to inject it, in general, people...
Now, is that the operating cost to do that or the upfront cost of the technology?
That includes capital and operating, and with some assumption of financing costs, which today is a big assumption, because credit markets are not widely open, as Mr. Crane pointed out.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with Frank, and in this, normally you would express in our industry in dollars per megawatt, but in this market where you can't get the money up front, a 500 megawatt power plant would be looking at $500 million or more in upfront costs to do it.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. All time for questions has expired. What I'm going to do now is ask each one of you to give us your 1-minute summation of what you want us to remember about your testimony as we move forward in drafting climate change legislation. We'll begin with you, Ms. Patton.
Thank you very much. In closing, Zurich believes that commercial scale deployment of CCS to meet must be achieved soon to meet the 2050 emission reduction goals. Zurich encourages this committee to proceed with legislation of whatever form you see fit that would provide the necessary funding and support to study and generate data that's necessary for us as an industry to properly underwrite risk and send price signals in the form of insurance premiums and otherwise support risk mitigating technologies. The more data that we have available, the better sites we can select and the lower fees that we can charge in terms of deploying our capital.
Thank you, Ms. Patton. Mr. Quinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd say again, several points I'd like to leave you with are that coal is indispensable for meeting our energy needs here in the United States as well as globally. No climate policy will be successful without coal with CCS. We must accelerate the development and deployment, widespread deployment of carbon capture and storage. And finally, the policy solutions to meet those needs must be harmonized so that expectations are harmonized with commercial availability of the enabling technology.
Thank you, Mr. Quinn. Mr. Alex.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My point is that CO2 capture technology is commercially available today from several vendors with commercial guarantees. Studies suggest that they have a high likelihood of success upon deployment. To get those projects deployed, we need some type of financial incentive offered from the government, either as part of a comprehensive climate bill or separately, and we suggest that those incentives be competitively awarded so we get the lowest cost solutions moving first at the best sites. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Duncan.
I believe that CO2 sequestration in deep brine reservoirs and oil reservoirs can be done safely and effectively. I think that in order to do this, I think that Congress should develop some sort of regulatory mechanism that encourages the best sites to be selected, just not okay sites. I also think that they should encourage the development of regulations for CO2 sequestration in association with enhanced oil recovery. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan. Mr. Crane.
Thank you, Chairman Markey. What I would try and focus the committee on is, as we go forward with looking at energy policy, to not get distracted by wind, solar, smart grids, conservation, efficiency. All those things are great, but what you're focused on today, this is central. Coal is central. Carbon capture and sequestration is central. And as you turn to how to incent that, focus on what we can do now. We need to get dirt turned. We've been studying this for so long. We need to get some metal in the ground to see what works and what's the cost of these various technological options.
Thank you, Mr. Crane. Mr. Hawkins.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, carbon capture and disposal technology is ready for commercial use today. The industry is waiting for a signal, and that signal has to come starting with this subcommittee. If you consider and adopt legislation that applies a cap to global warming emissions, that applies emission standards for new coal power investments, and that couples that with a financial incentive program to promote the early use of carbon capture and storage, you will make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. We thank each of you, and I couldn't agree with all of your testimony more. This is gentleman from Texas.
Since you're telling them that you agree with them, do I have the right to tell them that I'm disappointed that none of them mentioned the taxpayers and how much it would cost and how soon we would know that it would help, whether it be 10 years or 50 years, whether we'd know that we'd had any, and why they didn't mention China's inability or unwillingness to come forward and participate, Mexico, India, and the others. I think they ought to take those into considerations when they go to recommending what the taxpayers of this country have to pay for something they'll never receive.
I think they assumed that one of the members would mention all those facts, and they could keep their testimony on the subject that was at hand, which is that we have to find a solution to the burning of coal, not only here, but around the world, and only if we find the solution here can we export that solution to China and India and other countries. And so the burden is on our shoulders. We are the technological giants on the planet. The world is looking to us. We have to put in place the incentives to find the solution to these problems. Thank you, and we thank each of the witnesses for being here today.